Okay, next thing that I'd like to show you is how we take this Spring Boot application and make it into a web application. I am going to make it into a web application by adding another Spring Boot starter dependency and also by adding a controller. So back to my application here. The first thing I'm going to do is open my POM again. And I'm going to go down to the dependencies section, and I'm going to add, actually I think I'm going to change this dependency from Spring Boot Starter to Spring Boot Starter Web. And I'm going to save it. Now what this will do is it will actually change the dependencies that are brought in. If you want to take a close look at this, you can see that the list of Maven dependencies here is different. For one thing, it's slightly longer, and there are a number of dependencies that are brought in that are specific to web applications, okay, including some Tomcat embedded jars, which I'll discuss in just a moment. Now, let's go ahead and add a controller. I'll go ahead to my main package here and create a new class. And I can call this controller whatever I want because the name of the controller isn't relevant. And I'm going to go ahead and put an annotation on this to mark this as a Spring MVC controller. What I'm showing you right now isn't Spring Boot specific, but this is actually part of Spring MVC that has been around with us for the last 7 years at least. So what I'm going to do is create a simple method, a public string hi there method, and I'm going to have it return the predictable hello world. And to make this work with Spring MVC, I'm going to add a request mapping, and I'm going to map this to /hi. And I'm going to go ahead and put in a response body annotation here. This explains to Spring MVC that the string that's coming back needs to be interpreted as the response, not the name of a page to be rendered. We're going to see this change in just a bit. Okay, that's it. Now if I take this boot application and I run this again, you'll see the application starts up, but it does a little bit more this time. It's a web application, so you can see from the red button here that it's actually still running. Even though I am running this as just a regular Java application, it has started up a web application. This is one of the first things to notice about Spring Boot is I can run a web application from just a Java main method. I don't have to run inside of a container like Tomcat or JBoss unless I want to. The next thing, let's go ahead and try this out. I'm just going to open up a browser, go to localhost 8080, and go to /hi. And you can see that I have the predictable hello world message. So, what just happened here? Well, first of all, I added the Spring Boot Starter web dependency. And to be more specific, I substituted the one that was there because I happen to know that when it comes to the transitive dependencies, it would happen to be redundant. It would just bring in the same dependencies. Now, the Spring Boot Starter web, if you were to take a look at the dependencies that it brings in Spring Web and Spring MVC, and it adds embedded Tomcat jars, which makes it possible for us to run a web application from just a command line. Now, when the application actually started, the Spring application context starts the same as it always does. Your beans are created, and then the enable auto configuration kicks in. The enable auto configuration actually tries to determine if there's any missing beans. Now, it does this based on the beans that you have defined in your application configuration, which I only had one controller. That was the only thing that I really defined. And also any classes that you happen to have on the class path. Now, in our case, the enable auto configuration notices that we have Spring MVC jars on the class path. So it derives from that we want to have a web application. After all, why else would the jars be there? So what Spring Boot automatically does is it automatically creates the MVC beans for us. And this is the time saver. It automatically creates the dispatcher servlet. It automatically creates the handler mappers, mappings and the adapters and view resolvers that I need. So ordinarily, in the old days, when I started a Spring web application, I had to spend time Googling to figure out what the XML configuration was for those things. Now I don't have to do that. I just launch my application, fill in what I want to do, and have Spring Boot fill in the rest. Now the other neat thing that happens here is Spring Boot actually launched this web application using an embedded Tomcat instance. That makes it so I don't have to create a WAR file and deploy this on Tomcat or WebSphere or WebLogic or whatever. I can run this from the command line. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, this is nice that I can run outside of a container, but I don't really want to. I mean, in our organization, we use WAR files, and we're used to it. It's part of our change controls. So what if I want to have a WAR file? Well, it's no problem. To convert from a jar to a WAR, all you have to do is go into the POM and change the way it's packaged. And then you just need to have a Spring Boot servlet initializer. In order to have a WAR, you have to abide by the servlet specification, and the servlet specification requires some type of initializer, either a WebXML or something. So the easiest way to do this is with a Spring Boot servlet initializer. Then what you do is you create a WAR, and you can actually deploy it to an application server. And then when you deploy it to the application server, take a close look at this URL here. It's slightly different. I actually have the application as part of the context name there. So let me show you how to turn this into a WAR. So taking a look at my application again, what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to go to my POM and I'm going to change the packaging from jar to WAR. Save that, and that's change number 1. The second change is I'm going to go into my application class and I'm going to extend Spring Boot Servlet Initializer. Now when I extend Spring Boot Servlet Initializer, I have the option of overriding the main configuration method. So I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of that by right-clicking, going into Source, going into Override Implement Methods, because I can't remember what the name of the method is, and I'll just select Configure here. So this is my Configure method. Notice that it takes something called a Spring Application Builder, and it returns something called a Spring Application Builder. So the Spring Application Builder is it's something that implements the builder pattern, and as part of the application startup cycle, it will actually call the builder and build the configuration. So I don't have to launch the Spring application. The container will launch it for me. So what I'll do here is I'll just change this code slightly, and I'll make it so that I return builder.sources, and I'm going to add the same class that I used up above as my configuration. So what this means is that if I am running as a WAR, this method will be called. But if I'm running as a jar, this method will be used. So this is actually kind of neat. I can switch back and forth between running as a jar or running as a WAR, however I like. Now once I do this, you can see I have a little error here, and the error is simply saying that my project configuration is not up to date because I changed its packaging. So I'll just go into Maven Update Project. This is just something in Eclipse, the Maven 2 Eclipse plugin, to keep the Eclipse configuration information up to date with what's happening in Maven. Next, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and take the microservices boot project here, and I will drag it down to my server, which I happen to have a Tomcat 8 here, and I'll go ahead and launch it. The application starts up within the container this time. And if I go to a browser, like my Chrome browser, if I try this URL again, it's not going to work. I'm going to get an error page here. But if I add the context of my application, which happens to be demo, then my application works the same as it did before. So I can either run as a WAR file or a jar file. One other thing that is interesting to point out here is how you actually create that jar file or WAR file. Since I'm using Maven in my IDE, I can just say run as, and I can do a Maven install, and we can actually get the WAR file or the jar file, and we can actually see what's inside of it. I'm not going to go ahead and go through this. I just want to point out that's how you can do that. Okay, what about web pages? You're probably taking a look at this and saying, well, this is nice that I can say hello world, but what if I want to have a web page based on JSP or some templating philosophy? Well, Spring MVC provides support for a wide range of view options, including JSPs, but not limited to JSPs. Also supported are FreeMarker, Velocity, TimeLeaf, and a number of other things. The nice thing about working with Spring Boot is Spring Boot automatically establishes a default based on the dependency that you bring in. Now, in the coming slides, what I'm going to do is show you how I can use TimeLeaf as a templating technology by using Spring Boot Starter TimeLeaf. So let me show you what this looks like, Spring Boot with TimeLeaf web pages. First of all, I should probably explain what TimeLeaf is. TimeLeaf is a web templating technology. The nice thing about it is it's called natural templating. And actually, if you want to learn more about it, it's just type in TimeLeaf. Make sure you spell it like thyme, the spice. And you'll see that it's a very natural templating language that allows you to work with regular HTML, regular CSS, regular JavaScript. So if you're a web developer, this is what you really want to do. You really don't want to work with JSPs per se. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add another dependency here. I'll do this in my configuration file simply by copying and pasting one of the existing dependencies and add a Spring Boot Starter TimeLeaf, ThymeLeaf, and save it. Now you may be wondering how I knew what the starter was, Spring Boot Starter TimeLeaf, how I knew what that artifact was. Well, the way I know that is because it's documented in the Spring Boot reference. If you open up a browser and do a search, not on Spring reference, but on Spring Boot reference, you'll see a result for the Spring Boot reference guide. And when you're in the Spring Boot reference guide, this is basically describing all of the capabilities that I'm going through right now. When you're in here, go ahead and do a search for Starter POMs, and you will see the section of the reference guide that describes all of the starter POMs that are available. So you can see I have Spring Boot Starter, Spring Boot Starter Actuator, AMQP, AOP, Batch. You see where this is going. I have lots of different starters for the different types of technologies that are out there. And the way it works is all of these starters are defined in the parent project. And all of the various dependencies and their versions are defined in the parent project. So if I needed to do something with HornetQ, I don't have to worry about finding out the latest stable release of HornetQ or which jars or transitive dependencies are needed. I just add Spring Boot Starter HornetQ, and I would get that. Now, if something that you want to work with isn't in this list, don't worry. You can always add your own dependencies. This is just a list of the starters that are included with Spring Boot that work out of the box. And you can see here, Spring Boot Starter TimeLeaf supports the TimeLeaf templating engine. So that's how I know that the Spring Boot Starter TimeLeaf is what I wanted. The next thing I need to do is create a templates folder, because when Spring Boot works with a web application, it expects the templates to be in a location based on its opinions. Now you could configure this to be in some other place, but Spring Boot is going to look for a folder called templates. And whether you're using Velocity or FreeMarker or TimeLeaf, any template is going to be assumed to be in the templates folders. Now there's other locations that it will look as well, but this is the primary. So I'm going to create an HTML page. I'll just call this hello.html. And this is a true HTML page that I'm creating with a real body. It's not going to be very sophisticated. And I'm going to say hello, and let's make it interesting here. I'll put a span in here. And the reason I'm doing this is to show off the natural templating that TimeLeaf has from a TimeLeaf page. Okay. Now this span is actually going to be replaced dynamically by Spring MVC. So what I'll go ahead and do is put in a special little bit of syntax here. A nice little placeholder. Now I'll go back to my whatever I want controller. I should have named it something else. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this. So I'm going to make a couple of changes to it just to make it interesting. First of all, I'm going to take out that response body because what I want to return here is a logical view name. The word hello is going to be a logical view name. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to include a couple of parameters here. First of all, in my URL, I'm going to add a path parameter here. This is going to be the name that I want to pick up. This is just straight Spring MVC. And I'm going to create a map, just a regular Java util map. And I'm going to call it model. And I'm going to have a path variable to pick up that string, and it's going to be called name. Okay. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to make it so that we put someone's name in the URL and have that picked up automatically and displayed in the page. And the way I do that is by going to my model and putting the key name, and the value is going to be my variable name. And we'll go ahead and put that out there. I do have some warnings here which I could address if I was concerned about it, but I'm not really too concerned right now. What I'd like to do is just go ahead and run my web application. So I'm going to go ahead and restart this. I was watching it. I didn't see that it restarted, so I'm going to restart it manually. Depending on your change, Tomcat is going to restart automatically, but I just didn't notice it. And I'm going to put in my name here. And look at that. It says, hello, Ken from a TimeLeaf page. So let's go ahead and go through what just happened. So first of all, I added Spring Boot Starter TimeLeaf. And that caused all of the required jars to be brought in. And Spring Boot automatically configured Spring MVC to work with TimeLeaf. Specifically, it brought in something called a TimeLeaf View Resolver. If you were doing this by hand, you'd have to go out to the TimeLeaf documentation, and you can take a look at it. There's probably 20 pages of how to configure it to work with Spring. I didn't have to do any of that. I just used Spring Boot. The controller returned a logical view name, the word hello. The View Resolver found a matching template in my templates folder, and it rendered it. Now, just to give you an idea of what this natural templating is all about, if you take a look at my template, you can see what TimeLeaf is doing. If I am a web developer and I want to open this and test it, I would probably test it locally with a web browser like this. So you can see name goes here. So I can type in whatever dummy text that I need to work with TimeLeaf. But then at runtime, what happens is this th text actually replaces the text with this parameter here called name. And name was actually placed on what we call the model, and the model came from the controller. Okay, so just by putting something on the model, it is passed to the page. The reason that I have this value is because the request mapping has a placeholder in it, and the path variable picked that up. If you want to learn more about this particular part of working with TimeLeaf or Spring MVC, then take a look at the Spring Reference Guide, specifically the section on web applications with Spring MVC. Web MVC Framework. And this whole section is going to explain Spring MVC in a lot more detail if you're interested.